Welcome, everyone. I'm Scott Cassell, CEO and founder of the Product Stewardship Institute, and I want to thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled Lighting Up Safe Collection of Mercury Lights in Environmental Justice Communities and Beyond. Today's speakers will explore the problems, potential solutions, and best practices for end-of-life management of lighting, with a focus on the unique needs and challenges of low-income and marginalized communities. They will also outline practical strategies for improving the safe management of lights, including in environmental justice communities. Today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll tell you more about how to access the recording and slides in just a little bit. But before we hear from our speakers, I'd like to introduce you briefly to our organization, the Product Stewardship Institute, or PSI. So for those not familiar with us, PSI has been building capacity for product stewardship and extended producer responsibility, EPR, in the United States for the past 20 years. As you see from the left of the slide, we have 47 state agencies and hundreds of local governments, which are our members. That's members of our board of directors that govern our organization. We also have over 100 partners from companies, organizations, universities, and international governments. We also convene dialogues around different stakeholders and discuss principles and develop agreements on many different product categories. We work on over 25 different products, including fluorescent lamps, and there's 122 EPR laws that have been passed. Last night, one on solar panels was just passed in Niagara County, New York. Today, we're pleased to present 4 speakers, each with significant expertise working on light stewardship and in environmental justice communities. They'll provide an overview of light stewardship, explain how they're working to safely manage lights and collect them and recycle them to protect public and worker safety while reducing waste, and discuss best practices, challenges, potential solutions, and lessons learned, including those related to working in EJ communities. Today's speakers are, from left to right, Suna Bayrakal, Director of Policy and Programs right here at PSI. Bruce Fritz, he is the Household Hazardous Waste Manager in the division of, in the HHW division of the Alameda County Department of Environmental Health in California. Manny Chung, Vice President of Operations at Product Care Association in Canada, and Bradley Angel, Executive Director of Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice based in California. So I'll be your moderator today. I'm going to be compiling questions as they come in, and I'll be asking them of the speakers during the Q&A portion of the webinar after the speaker presentations. But I want to encourage you, please send in your questions into the Q&A box as you have them, so that they get off your head into our box here, and we'll ask them at the appropriate time. But before we get this started, I'd like to pass the virtual mic to Amanda Nicholson, who will cover a few logistical items to ensure everyone is able to participate smoothly. Amanda?
Thanks, Scott. In today's Zoom webinar, we have the option of using the telephone or computer audio. To select your audio or to switch audio during the event, click on Audio Settings in the lower left corner of your screen. From there, you can also test your speaker and mic or switch between multiple audio devices that may be connected to your computer. You can also change the view of your screen to select or to exit full screen, or to zoom in, or to click on View Options at the top of your screen, up here where the arrow is. To ask questions, click on the Q&A icon located at the bottom center of your screen, whether you have a technical question, such as you need help with your audio, or a content-related question, like a clarification on a particular point that one of our speakers made. Please type your question into the field that reads, "Type your question here," and click Send. The PSI team will answer technical questions, while our moderator, Scott, will ask the questions related to the content during the Q&A period at the end of the presentations. Lastly, the recording of today's webinar will be posted to the Lighting Up Safe Collection of Mercury Lights webinar page within 48 hours. You will also receive a direct link to that page via email after the event. And you can always find the recordings of this event and other past PSI events on the on-demand webinars section of our website. Just click events at the far right of PSI's website menu, then click on on-demand webinars as seen here. Back to you, Scott.
Great, thanks very much, Amanda. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, PSI's own Suna Bayrakal, who heads up our research, policy development, and programs on hazardous products like mercury lights, as well as several other product areas. Suna?
Thank you, Scott. Happy to be doing this webinar on a product that currently is not necessarily high on the radar, it seems, but one that is so ubiquitous that it really needs more attention, especially given the toxicity of its components and disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations. So today, in my presentation, I will discuss why lights recycling is important, get clear on the types of lights that contain mercury, talk a little bit about the how, outline best practices in developing and improving lights collection programs, best practices in outreach and education, and also collection and storage. I will also talk about key challenges faced by lights collection programs, and in light of these challenges, no pun intended, what can be done to further advance light stewardship. Next slide, please. Before I dive in, though, I just want to give a little bit of background on PSI's experience in this area and some context for the webinar as well. So we have over a decade of work in this area. There's just a few highlights here on this slide. We have worked nationally. We've developed stewardship action plan for fluorescent lights to address key issues and identify potential solutions. We held 4 national multi-stakeholder meetings in the 2008-2009 time period. We have also worked in Oklahoma and Massachusetts on education and outreach that facilitated in Oklahoma notable collections of mercury lamps and mercury thermostats as well. And in Massachusetts, supported the education of over 6,500 workers that included custodians, electrical workers, maintenance workers, trash workers, and laborers as well. Next slide, please. So this webinar is the culmination of an education and awareness project that we are currently working on in California to increase safe management of mercury lights, with an additional focus on addressing an important gap that exists in educational efforts in this area. These awareness raising initiatives on health and environmental threats of mercury lights typically overlook maintenance workers and sanitation workers and low-income tenants, leaving them a little more susceptible to harm. And as Bradley Angel will speak about later, these same marginalized groups also generally bear the brunt of the health and environmental impacts of low recycling rates and sort of widespread inappropriate disposal as well. I'm not going to run through the slide. You can see here we've done a number of things. All the materials we've generated or developed are freely available on our project page, which I will talk about at the end. I'll provide the link at the end of the presentation. Next slide. So why is this important? Several laws in the US prohibit trash disposal of mercury lights, but many are illegally thrown in the trash. EPA requires commercially generated lights to be managed as universal waste, which cannot be disposed in the trash, but households are generally exempt. But there are state laws that ban or prohibit trash disposal of all mercury lights. Illegal dumping can also be an issue in low-income and marginalized communities. There were over 1 million mercury lamps disposed of in landfills in 2017. Lamps often break when they're thrown in the trash, which expose workers to mercury, which is a significant health threat. Next slide, please. Just some other reasons to recycle lights, some of which I've covered, but recover valuable materials, including glass and aluminum, create recycling jobs, and reduce the need for virgin materials to be extracted, which can also reduce greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. Next slide. Just to give you an idea, to kind of get clear on the types of lights that contain mercury, there's fluorescent bulbs, which can be a variety of shapes. and sizes, high intensity discharge bulbs, and neon bulbs as well. Next slide. Thanks. LED lights have grown in use and are extremely energy efficient and save money because they're energy efficient, even relative to fluorescents, which were even more energy efficient than incandescent lights. But studies have shown that they do contain toxics as well and need to be managed safely. Next slide. So how do we accomplish effective and safe lights collection? In terms of program development, first we create a plan, consider the product scope. The product scope may include only residential lights or commercial lights or both. You might also decide to include LED in addition to mercury-containing lights. If possible, have a broadest scope as possible. If you have exceptions, you might end up finding them in your collections regardless. It's important to understand your community. If the community is primarily residential or commercial, it affects whether you might focus on residential versus commercial lamps. Low home ownership and multifamily, a lot of multifamily units means that property managers would be an important audience to target with your outreach. And in marginalized and low-income communities, early and continuous public involvement, keeping the community informed, communicating appropriately with language materials and languages that the community can understand is especially important. Again, Bradley will talk more on that in his presentation. In terms of partnerships and collaboration, look for champions in the community who are enthusiastic supporters of the project and willing to set aside time. Consider whether there are synergies with existing initiatives that can also drive safe lights management. For example, utility energy efficiency programs, mercury reduction initiatives in water districts. Unions can serve as highly effective and engaged channels of communication, and retailers have an important role to play in engaging and messaging to residents and small contractors. They can serve as collection locations, and they tend to have longer hours and generally more numerous and convenient than household hazardous waste locations. In terms of program funding, funding solutions for your program can include legislation such as that of extended producer responsibility, which I'll discuss in a little more detail and Scott had mentioned earlier. And also Manny Chung will also talk about EPR programs in his presentation. Grant funding is a possibility. Look for partnerships with utilities, water districts, and others who can support the program. Implement the program and improve, measure your progress and the effectiveness of the program, and do periodic reporting or evaluating to look for potential areas of improvement. Next slide, please. Best practices on outreach and education. I'm not going to go through all of this, but what are the essential messages? Really the benefits of proper lights management, where the collection options are is critical. Getting the word out in a variety of formats, continuous messaging, communicate appropriately, including language access. On the slide, you can see examples of our educational outreach materials that we developed for this project in California. We did it in English. These materials are available in English, Chinese, and Spanish. Next slide, please. In terms of best practices for collection and storage. If you're a resident, definitely store, transport a closed container in a way that prevents breakage. For businesses, follow universal waste requirements. Universal waste, for those who aren't familiar, are waste that meet the criteria of a hazardous waste and are widely generated by households and businesses, but don't typically pose an immediate and excessive risk. And they generally have streamlined standards for handling, storage, and transport to encourage recycling, but they still have full hazardous waste requirements for end-of-life recycling, treatment, and disposal. Next slide, please. So through our work and research, we've identified the following key challenges associated with lights collection and recycling. Sustainable funding is at the top. A major barrier to lights collection and recycling is cost for governments, for property managers, small contractors, and others. This cost issue can really contribute to trash disposal or illegal dumping of lights. Local governments fund recycling as part of their HHW collection. They have grants, but these grants may not cover all the costs, and voluntary corporate or other partner funding may be intermittent and not adequate to cover these costs. There's a lack of awareness and education. This may be particularly acute in low-income and marginalized environmental justice communities. There's need for more collection convenience. More collection options make it easier and therefore more likely that people will recycle. There's a lack of enforcement because non-compliance with these laws that prohibit trash disposal are often not enforced. There's less incentive for business property managers to comply. Trash disposal is cheaper. It comes back again to the cost. Next slide, please. So I just talked about challenges. Now I want to discuss a few lessons learned and potential solutions that may help further advance light stewardship. As I mentioned earlier, newer lighting technologies are increasingly replacing fluorescent lights. Data from the National Electrical Manufacturers Association show that fluorescent light sales have experienced a steady decline of more than 50% from 2015 to 2020, while LEDs have increased their portion of the market during that time. And while LEDs have the potential to save energy and improve lighting quality, they definitely have their challenges. I mentioned earlier that there are some hazardous components. They can be difficult to recycle, and they tend to be unregulated, but they do have recyclable components, aluminum, steel, and copper as well. So in terms of learning from light CPR programs, just again giving an overview here, Manny Chung from Product Care will provide more detail about light CPR programs in Canada and the US. And I believe Bruce Fritz from Alameda County will touch on EPR a little bit in his presentation, sort of comparing, contrasting his lights recycling program with the mandated EPR program for pharmaceuticals in his county and what they've been able to accomplish there. But EPR, what is EPR? It requires funding to collect and recycle or dispose of products of end of life. And requires that funding be provided by manufacturers or the consumer rather than the taxpayer. And manufacturers are typically required to increase the number of collection sites, so increasing convenience, and also provide education and outreach. This approach incentivizes reducing the toxics and taking environmental impacts into consideration in the product design as well. In the US, there's 122 EPR laws in 33 states, as Scott had mentioned earlier, and Washington, DC as well for a range of products, mercury lights being one of them. And EPR laws have proven effective at spurring substantial increases in collection, recycling, and safe disposal. So in terms of what has been achieved in the US, there are currently 5 states with EPR lights laws, and in Canada also has legislative light CPR programs. In terms of collection convenience, there's over 150 collection sites in Vermont, over 442 collection sites in British Columbia. In terms of safe collection and recycling, Vermont has the highest recovery in per capita mercury lights collection rates nationally. And in the first program year, they achieved 37% of mercury lights recycled compared to a national average of 5% at that time. Some of the key lessons learned are really a broad product scope is best. For collection, sustainable funding definitely makes a difference, and collection convenience is key as well. Lastly, I just want to talk about other ways to take action. Supportive policies, such as public utility policies requiring recycling of lights recovered from customers' homes during energy efficiency initiatives, can help funnel those lights into proper end-of-life management. Regulatory requirements that renovation demolition contractors implement a recycling plan or other requirements can also help, and ordinances that require commercial recycling beyond just renovation and demolition, but for multifamily and commercial properties is another approach. Also, establishing a network, a statewide group with key stakeholders that meets regularly on lights recycling can also help advance lights recycling. Next slide, please. And just a last note on additional resources. We developed the Advancing Safe Collection and Recycling of Lights in California how-to guide with input from dozens of external experts around the country. These materials are freely available on our California project page, which is this recycle lamps. So the educational flyers we have for residents and property managers and contractors, we have a worker safety poster. All those materials are in the 3 languages I mentioned earlier. There are presentations that we collaborated with Green Action on to present in 4 environmental justice network meetings around California. Those are available in English and Spanish as well. And even though they're developed with California in mind, I really think these materials can be more broadly useful in other jurisdictions, and I encourage you to take a quick look. And thank you very much. That concludes my presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Suna. And for those in the audience, please start to send in any questions you have now through that Q&A box. I did take a look at those that are on the line here, and we have quite a few experts, which is great, experts on mercury and lighting as well. There was one question asking whether the slides and recording would be available. Yes, the answer is, and that will be within 1 day. So we'll be able to get it to you tomorrow, the recording of this. Next, I'd like to introduce Bruce Fritz. Bruce is the HHW manager for the Alameda County Department of Environmental Health in California. Their HHW program has collected and recycled lamps for almost 30 years. Bruce.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Park Stewardship Institute and Suna for getting in touch with me. When I heard about the project that PSI is doing with lamps, I immediately recognized it aligned with the Household Hazardous Waste Program's charter and goals. In Alameda County, the Household Hazardous Waste Program is part of the Healthcare Services Agency. So we're dedicated to delivering services equitably to all county residents to promote health and environmental quality. Next slide, please. When state and federal laws mandated household hazardous waste program, Alameda County was quick to respond by building permanent facilities. The picture on the slide there shows one of our first facilities built in 1993. It popped up in the middle of an open field. It's now surrounded by a busy industrial park. Just to note, household hazardous waste facilities are industrial, so we're always located in industrial zoned locations, which also means we're never located close to most residents in an area. Let's see, currently we have 4 facilities in Alameda County. We offer more services to residents than almost any other county I know of. Those facilities are open either 3 or 4 days a week, every week. And up until COVID arrived, we didn't require any appointments. So we are out there for the residents and businesses as well. Household hazardous waste programs are publicly funded. In Alameda County, the facilities were originally funded by a tipping fee on garbage. As garbage solid waste generation declined and the population increased, we got funding through a property tax roll on each residential unit. So our services are paid for by everybody, every resident, I should say. Now, household hazardous waste programs are particularly important in California because California recognized the need to protect the land and water from a wider variety and a greater amount of toxic materials than almost any other state. And residents generally don't have much of an option other than using a household hazardous waste program to get rid of most of their toxic and hazardous materials. So there's an even greater burden on businesses and residents to dispose of hazardous waste in California. Next slide, please. California and especially the Bay Area has a long history with mercury and mercury pollution. Mercury was mined locally and used in the gold during the gold rush and to refine gold. Mercury was mixed with ore to form an amalgam with the gold, and then the mercury was boiled off to refine the gold. That means that a lot of the mercury was lost to vapor, which ended up in the watershed, which ended up in the bay. Public health recommendations still indicate that pregnant women should not eat any fish from the bay ever, due to mercury pollution and high levels that bioaccumulate through the food chain in the bay. Perhaps these are some reasons that the California hazardous waste laws are stricter than most. But those same strict laws forced business to recycle and properly dispose of lamps. And they also prompted innovation. One of the earliest and first dedicated fluorescent lamp recycling systems was designed and manufactured right here in Richmond, California. California was also an early adopter of the universal waste rules, which were in part prompted by the availability of appropriate technology to actually recycle the lamps. Next slide, please. So I want to go over some of the things that Alameda County's Household Hazardous Waste Program has done that are innovative or perhaps different than other household hazardous waste programs. We've a number of innovations that make it easier for both residents and businesses. Collecting lamps has always been part of the Household Hazardous Waste Program, even before lamps were universal waste. But when lamps became universal waste, we started a program with what we call community partners, first with a number of cities throughout the county, so that they collect lamps and bring them to the Household Hazardous Waste Program. These partners do have to collect the lamps and bring them into the HHW program, but the HHW program then sorts the lamps out, properly packages them, and transports them to the recyclers. We also provide the partners with free collection containers and instructions. So all of that at no cost to the collection partners. Later on, after a grant from our local utility, PG&E, we extended the community partners to some hardware stores and some other places like apartment buildings. That program was paid for by PG&E, but we continued it long after that grant expired. In 2013 or 2015, when we expanded our services, we now offer free disposal of hazardous waste, including lamps, to residential landlords. And we offer a drop-in business program because the waste is universal waste. There's no appointment necessary, and it's easier for a business to drop in. They don't have to register in advance. So businesses do pay when they bring in lamps. We charge $2 a pound for straight lights, which means about $1 for a 4-foot lamp. Compact lamps are charged at $3 a pound, and HIDs are charged at $4 a pound. This is approximately what we calculate our costs are for transportation and recycling. And these programs are very popular with regular businesses, both the drop-in and also the regular hazardous waste generating businesses. Next slide. First, I would say there's a large need to dispose of lamps. We continue to collect lamps. Collection has been fairly stable in the last couple of years, but it hasn't increased, but it hasn't dropped off much either. And the community collection partners account for a very large slice of the lamps collected. Among businesses, the drop-in program accounts for a very large slice of the lamps collected, and probably about 20% of all the lamps that the Household Hazardous Waste Program collects. Notably, we're not seeing a lot of landlords bring in lamps, although they do. And when they do represent a lot of residential units. But multifamily units in the county account for about 30% of the residential units. And many of the people that live in multifamily units, of course, do drop off lamps at the HHW facility. Businesses, okay. So just looking at, let's go to the next slide. Looking at some of our successes, of course, there's been a steady increase in lamp collection. In the 90s, we were seeing less than a ton of lamps a year. Now we're seeing way over 50 tons a year. Alameda County is an environmentally conscientious place, and lamp collection from residents and businesses has really been quite successful for the county household hazardous waste program. For residents, having the partners with their drop-off locations close to the residents themselves has been really quite successful, and the numbers show it. It's convenient, and that encourages people to drop the lights off. These partners bring in a large percentage of the lamps that our program collects and processes. There's still a large need for mercury lamp disposal, despite the growing use of LEDs. As I mentioned, the amount of lamps that our county program has collected has not decreased. It hasn't increased in recent years, but a couple of the recent years were kind of odd anyway. And I think community collection programs is particularly successful, notably when there's an incentive for the community collection partner. So if a recycle center can charge their customers if the customers bring in a large amount of lights over a certain amount, that's an incentive. And when a hardware store can gain customer loyalty by offering a service of disposing of their used lamps, this helps. These businesses seem very happy to participate in our partnership program and to take the care and space and time it takes to properly collect the lamps. So different from regular household hazardous waste, lamps received from residents that just come and drop them off at one of our 4 household hazardous waste programs weigh less than 50% of all the lamps we collect. So clearly, offering the services that are out in the community and easy to use are attractive. Regularly, household hazardous waste is dropped off by residents during what we think may think of as spring cleaning, which might happen every 5 to 10 years. Finally, larger quantities. Finally, businesses. They have options. They have a lot of options for lamp disposal. However, they're usually costly. If a business has a lot of lights, they usually have to pay to get a truck just to show up at their site and pay a lot. If they want to package and mail the lamps back to a recycler, the cost is pretty high, usually between about $3 to $5 per 4-foot lamp. That compares compares very closely to the cost of the original product. So our program is very popular, and especially with businesses. We don't demand that they do anything to get set up in advance, and we don't even demand that they package the lamps appropriately for long distance shipping or mailing back. And so these are why our programs are popular. Next slide, please. Nevertheless, there are challenges. We've done a great job in collecting lights, but we still project that there's lights out there in almost every business and home. Despite our efforts to make it more convenient, there's still very few places where people and businesses can just drop lights off, especially for straight lights. It's a burden on residents. They have to carefully package and transport their lamps and to a household hazardous waste site or one of the community collection partners. And it's a burden on government because getting rid of lights is significantly more costly per pound than other types of hazardous waste. There's also inequity, and it's very apparent for lamp recycling. You have to have a lot of extra time and energy to find a recycling site, to look it up, to safely pack your lamps, to take them down there. And often the drop-off locations are only open during regular business hours. The existing sites for dropping off lamps are not very well distributed around the county. And residents of multifamily housing have even less options. They probably don't have curbside pickup for their compact fluorescents, and they may be less likely to be a customer at one of the hardware stores or big home repair stores that offer recycling. Getting the information is also difficult. We have good resources in the county. The county's stopwaste.org webpage is great. So is Earth 911 and other resources, but there's no centralized source of information. Finding out is hard, and you have to have some pretty good persistence to figure it out. Targeting public outreach is especially difficult to residents in multifamily housing. And people in an apartment or other multifamily housing are just as likely to need to get rid of lamps as they are as any other resident in the county. And for businesses, and universal waste regulations do make lamp recycling easier, but a lot of businesses, well, first of all, lamps are ubiquitous. Every business has lamps, and many businesses are just not used to hazardous waste regulations and strict requirements. The cost and trouble of doing the recycling also may dissuade businesses from doing the right thing. There's also significant challenges in doing the outreach to businesses. So, next slide. As a possible response to some of these challenges, I wanted to touch on a local case study. In Alameda County, we're very proud to have one of the first in the nation local product stewardship ordinances that has to do with disposal of drugs and medicines, as well as sharps. We enacted the ordinance after many years and much struggle. Particularly the last chief and head of the household hazardous waste program here spent almost 20 years of consistent work promoting and putting the helping to put the medicines product stewardship ordinance into play. The ordinance can provide a possible example of how lamp issues could be improved. Before the ordinance in Alameda County, there were 6 locations where county residents could drop off their drugs, or 6 locations you could easily identify. After over 4 years of implementation, there are now over 80 locations where residents can drop off their medications. The product stewardship organization involved is a central point of information and make it easy to find a drop-off site. There's an education campaign, and awareness is growing. And of course, the stewardship organization and the manufacturers of pharmaceuticals cover all the costs. So I want to leave you with the image on the screen. Yes, this is the product stewardship organization's webpage for drugs disposal, but if a product stewardship ordinance if a product stewardship were, however it would be implemented in Alameda County, this could just as easily be an image of places where everybody could drop off their lamps in the county. And again, it would make a huge difference as far as ease of lamp disposal. So thank you very much for listening and letting me promote the Household Hazardous Waste program a little bit. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions.
Great, thanks very much, Bruce. Very impressive work that the county has done. We've gotten in a couple of other questions for you that we'll be taking shortly. Others, please submit any questions you have for Bruce at this time if you haven't done so already. The image you have there is a great one for us to keep in mind for lamps, not only convenient for the resident, but paid for by the companies that are selling those lamps, as it is with pharmaceuticals and the sharps as well. So thanks for that. Our next speaker will be Manny Chung. Manny is the Vice President of Operations for the Product Care Association. It's a stewardship organization that implements a range of stewardship programs, including those for lights on behalf of producers in Canada and also the United States. Manny?
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to PSI for inviting me to present in today's sessions. Good morning or good afternoon to everyone. In my presentation today, I've been asked to provide a short, high-level overview of extended producer programs relating to lighting products, and more specifically, the mercury lighting products under Product Care's programs across Canada. And specifically, I'll be looking at focusing in a little bit more on BC and Washington State. If we were to go into detail and delve into all our lighting programs, I don't think we have the time today. So That's what we'll be covering off in my presentation. So next slide, please. Just a little bit about Product Care Association itself. Product Care is a non-for-profit organization that develops and manages, operates EPR programs in Canada and in the US on behalf of our members. It was established in 1994. Currently, we operate 8 paint programs, 4 HHW programs, 5 lighting programs, and 1 program for smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a bit of a geographic picture of the programs we operate, the jurisdictions that we operate in. So you can see there's lights, paints, and HHW and smoke alarms. In addition, you'll see that there's electrical recycle and OPIC on the left-hand side. Those are programs that we work with, and they operate for small appliances, power tools, exercise equipment, and so forth, those type of products. You'll see that Washington State, we have a lighting program that we operate, Light Recycle Washington. Also, his Product Care has been involved in other, in the past or currently in other stewardship programs such as major appliances and electronics. And for those in the US, we were involved in the original paint care programs that started in Oregon and California. So we have a vast experience in EPR programs. You'll notice in the map here that there's one province that is whited out, and that is Alberta. Alberta traditionally has not had extended producer responsibility type of regulations or programs. However, they are now just starting to have consultations and are looking at to implement EPR for paper, printed paper and packaging, along with household hazardous waste. Next slide, please. So this is to give you a more closer look at the programs that we have for lighting products specifically. British Columbia was the first program that we had, which was in 2010. And then Manitoba also has a lighting program. Ontario is slated to have a lighting program come in 2023. We have a lighting program in Quebec and also PEI, and as previously mentioned, Washington State as well. Just in terms of the membership in our programs, there are about 226 lighting stewards in our program. And we have about over 1,400 collection sites in our network for lighting products. And as you can see on the right, we've had over 9.5 million lights collected just in 2020 alone. So next. To give some perspective on what products are obligated under the EPR regulations that we have in place. So on the top, you'll see we'll go from left to right. We have British Columbia, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, PEI, and Washington State. And I'll focus in a little bit more on BC and Washington State. So with British Columbia, it captures not only all lamp technology, including the mercury ones, as previously mentioned, the CFLs, the fluorescent tubes, the HIDs, but also other lamps, whether that be incandescents, halogens, or other material. In addition, it covers off or includes fixtures, lighting fixtures. So those are included, whether that be a desktop lamp or whether it be the 4-foot fluorescent tube fixture that's in typical offices. It also includes ballasts, whether they're PCB or non-PCB ballasts. Moving over to Manitoba, the regulation has obligated fluorescent tubes and CFLs only. And Ontario, as you can see, very similar to BC. Quebec is really focused in on mercury-containing lights, so it's only fluorescent tubes, CFLs, HIDs. PEI is very similar to BC, with the exception it does not include fixtures. And then Washington State, specifically, it's mercury-containing lamps. So once again, fluorescent tubes, CFLs, and HIDs are main categories. In terms of the generators that are included under the program, or what is the target audience that we're trying to capture the lamps from, you'll see from BC through to PEI, it includes residential and the ICI sector. So both businesses and the residents can bring lamps into the program. Washington state is unique, and you can see that it's defined by covered entities, and covered entities is basically any person who purchased mercury-containing lights at retail and delivers no more than 10 mercury lights to a registered collector on any given day. So Washington state's definition of the source of the post-consumer lamps is not as clear and precise, and that will lead into some challenges, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. Whereas if you include residential and ICI lamps, it's all in basically. Next slide, please. Just to talk a little bit about, in terms of a typical EPR program, what's involved, what's the process, and specifically around what Product Care does. So under all the programs that we mentioned so far, they are all obligated. So there is regulations in place, or in case the US laws in place that are passed, that passes the responsibility to industry to have an extended producer responsibility program for the lamps. And typically the regulatory agencies will require the stewardship agency or the brand owners to submit what's called a program plan that outlines how you're going to meet the requirements in each of the regulations. And then typically that plan goes through consultation and gets approved by the regulatory body. And then the implementation timeline is set and the start date is set. The program, the stewardship organization will then typically go, and the areas that they will have to develop include developing a collection network to allow the consumers to return the spent lamps, etc. You'll need to take care of service provider procurement and oversight. So that is engaging transporters, collectors, recyclers, in some cases, communication and outreach agencies, and so forth. So you need to develop that. Then you also need to come up with, what is your collection supply going to look like? What are you going to collect, use to collect these lamps? They're all different sizes, they're different lengths. Obviously, they're very fragile. In some cases, some of them have mercury. So you need to have that health and safety protection as well. And so those are some of the other considerations as well. Typically, the program actually provides the collection containers to all the collection sites and manages the collection transportation network and the recycling network as well. A big component of that, obviously, is informing consumers that this product should not be thrown in the trash. It is recyclable, that it's convenient, and there are many places to be able to bring these material for proper management and responsible recycling. Obviously, there's funding that's required to operate this program, and so a budgeting process and a fee setting process needs to come into effect in terms of how where's the funding going to come from in industry, how that's going to work, what are the fees going to be, and so forth, factoring all the expected costs related to the operational side of it. Another key component is the data tracking and management. Obviously, the regulations all have reporting requirements to the regulatory agency. So it's in, one of the key metrics is obviously going to be the amount of material that is collected and properly recycled and so forth. So it's key to set up a system that you can track where did it come from, which collection site, who the transporter is, how much volume there was, which recycler, if you have multiple recyclers, which recyclers it went to, how do the recyclers manage the products after they've process the material, and so forth. I think one of the key things that when we first got involved in the lighting sector for recycling was that we soon quickly realized, much like e-waste, that there weren't a lot of standards in place in terms of how you recycle a bulb or a lamp. In some cases, people consider just crushing it as processing. And so as an organization, we did our due diligence, and we saw the need to have more standardization, to raise the level of for processing and recycling so that it addresses all the health and safety needs, and to obviously try to get as much of the commodities on the back end out so that we can put it back into the upstream cycling in other manufacturing processes. So we saw a need to develop a standard, which Product Care did, and require all our recyclers to abide by that standard, and then oversight of the recyclers to ensure that they do so. Next slide, please. Just to give you a sense of a bit of flavor in terms of what the collection system looks like, and I'm going to hone in on BC and Washington State just to give you some direct comparisons. You'll see, BC almost doubles the amount of collection sites in Washington States. A lot of that has to do with BC has a robust collection infrastructure for recycling in general, and also regulatory requirement differences between the state and the province and so forth. So that's part of the main reason why you have some differences there. Events are used, but very limited for products such as so small and infrequent as lamps. We found that events aren't really the best way to go about collecting lamps. It's really about making that convenience of people being able to take it to their hardware store or their local recycling center or local transfer station seems to be the kind of concept of one-stop shop for the residents seems to drive the collection. You'll see that in BC, we have an array of different collection partners, including return to retail. Lamps tend to be a good fit for that. Local government facilities, that be landfills, transfer stations, recycling centers. We have bottle depots in British Columbia, which is beverage containers are regulated under the extended producer responsibility under the recycling regulation. And so we've got a network that in BC that collects bottles. There's distributors are involved, electrical distributors are involved in our collection network. And also relampers as well. The relampers are those individuals that go to a downtown building and they're retrofitting the entire building. And so they'll be moving the old technology and putting new technology. So we partnered with those individuals as well. And we have private enterprises and nonprofits. We have what we call a large volume direct pickup. So if you were a mall or a property manager or a school for that matter, and you had a place to be able to consolidate some amount of lamps, we would provide direct pickup service. You don't need to go and bring it to a collection site. We will come and get it and service you that way. So you'll see we've got a lot more variety, and if you compare it to Washington State, we don't have as many options for that collection network. And then if you do a comparison, British Columbia includes residential and commercial volumes. And as Washington State previously mentioned, the covered entities, it's limited. So very hard to do that because you can't differentiate a fluorescent tube that's used in the household versus a fluorescent tube used in the commercial building. Likewise, even with CFLs, there's no designation of commercial use only or industrial use only. So that causes some challenges with the Washington State program, where when it's included both residential and commercial, it makes it much easier as long as it's a lamp that meets the requirements, it's included. And then there's really no limit in British Columbia of how many lamps you can bring in, whereas Washington State, you have a limit of 10 maximum a day. Next slide, please.
Manny, if you could please wrap up, appreciate
Sure.
that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Just giving you a perspective of sales trends. I think the key point here is to look at Sales trends are trending down, specifically for the mercury-containing products. The succession technology for LEDs are coming on the market way faster than anyone participates. So it looks like the mercury-containing lamps are on its way out. You can see the bottom chart here showing that the LED lamps are the uptake, how fast that's going. And next slide, I'll show you some collection. I think the key takeaway from the collection area here is that 2019 seems to be a general point of where the collections are starting to decline. Now, that could be, you could say that it's related to COVID because of 2020, but we're looking at the first quarter of 2021 and the numbers are lower. It's higher, it's bounced back from 2020, but still lower than 2019. So that could give an indication that we're over the peak potentially, but hard to say. Next slide, please. So some program challenges that, these are not top of mind products. So consumer awareness is a challenge. I think these products are easy enough, especially the light bulbs, easy enough to go into trash bins. So there's not like a big 50-inch TV that's taking up space in your garage, and now you got to find a home for it. So that's part of the challenge. The lack of urgency and demand by consumers, another challenge. Again, it's a small bulb. Am I going to put a Rubbermaid tote at home to collect bulbs and then take it to a collection site, or do I throw it in the trash? The other challenge is funding. The product price versus the fee rate. The product price of these products are low. Again, if you compare it to a tire, it's much higher, mattress much higher, electronics much higher, so you can afford to have a higher fee rate on the product. But when you're talking about lamps that are low fee, it's very difficult to do that. We mentioned about the declining sales in the mercury ones, especially CFLs. Very few are on the market now, so that creates a funding challenge. The speed of technology shift to LEDs. LEDs are more durable, they last longer, and so for future, that's going to be another challenge to look at for funding. I think for EPR programs, difficulties in setting targets. There's too many variables. It's consumer behavior. If I flip the light on 20 more times than Scott does, my light bulb is probably going to burn out faster. I may manufacture better lamps. Someone may manufacture poor quality. So trying to time how much is available to collect, that's a very, very difficult thing to do. I mentioned before the difficulty of differentiating between residential versus commercial lamps. From the industry side, harmonization. That is the biggest challenge, as we saw with the chart. Some included mercury ones, some included all technologies, some included fixtures. So that's very challenging. Mentioned before the covered entity issue, trying to police what's coming in because you don't know if it's a retail sale or not. You can't. There's no different. There's nothing on a lamp that tells you otherwise. And part of the challenge is we got a lot of retailers participating. The big box stores in Washington State have been a challenge to come on board. We have better success in Canada on the big box stores participation. The other challenge is the commodities that come out the back end of the recycling. They're low volume. Glass is one of the hardest things to get value out of in solid waste management. So that is a challenge. And another challenge is the limited options for managing the various components that come in. So next slide. So that brings to conclusion my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manny. A lot of great information for us here and a lot of great experience that Product Care has. So now we're going to go on to our fourth and last speaker, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Please keep sending your questions in. Our next speaker is Bradley Angel. Bradley is the Executive Director for Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice, which is a California-based nonprofit that works to protect health and promote environmental, social, and economic justice. Bradley, nice to have you here.
Thank you so much, Scott, and everybody, and thanks to PSI for not only inviting us onto this webinar to share our experience, but for reaching out to us at the beginning of this project. So maybe the next slide, and I'll tell you a little more about Green Action. So Green Action for Health and Environmental Justice, we're community-led. We're a multiracial organization. We were founded way back in 1997 by grassroots leaders from mostly low-income and working-class urban, rural, and indigenous communities across California and Arizona. And I should add that we were formed by these amazing grassroots leaders, and I was honored to be asked to work with them in forming the organization. And the spur for Green Action being formed was that a very large, quite well-known international environmental group had actually decided that working with grassroots communities wasn't really relevant to their mission to protect the planet. And the people from these amazing grassroots leaders, mostly not, professional activists, in fact, not professional activists, but from communities that were getting dumped on and poisoned, and people in their communities and their families were getting sick and dying, and decided to come together so that communities could work together to protect their own health and environment, but also to transform the systems we live under that create all this pollution, and where this pollution disproportionately and in a very negative way harms the most vulnerable in our society. And so these grassroots leaders came up with the mission statement that you see in front of you, and we mobilize community power. We bring communities together as well to win victories, but very much, to win victories to protect health in specific communities, but also to change industry and government policies and practices. And that's why when Product Stewardship Institute reached out to us, we really saw this as fitting in a really good way with our mission statement. And we were really glad to work with PSI on this project. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Environmental justice and environmental racism issues really need to be considered when dealing with how do we reduce the toxicity of products, have cleaner products, but also, how do you deal with the products that do exist that do contain toxic contaminants, and what type of so-called recycling do we want to encourage? And the reason this is so important is that low-income and working-class communities and communities of color continue to bear the disproportionate and harmful burden of waste disposal, and in many cases of so-called recycling technologies. This picture here is from decades ago in a small farm worker town of Kettleman City in the Central Valley, San Joaquin Valley of California. It's home to the largest hazardous waste landfill in the Western United States. It has multiple pollution sources. And in fact, the state of California has finally acknowledged that as they allow continued dumping in this community at the giant hazardous waste landfill, they acknowledge that Kettleman City is one of the most vulnerable communities in the entire state to pollution. And so from Green Action's perspective in the communities, things need to change, and reducing the generation of toxic materials containing toxics, and working together with many stakeholders for safe alternatives is really key to health and justice for our society. So next slide, please. And so I want to tell you a little about Kettleman City and Buttonwillow and why it's relevant to this issue. These are the locations, both are low-income, working-class farm worker communities, predominantly Spanish-speaking, heavily impacted by many pollution sources. And is it a coincidence that the state's two hazardous waste landfills in California are both in Spanish-speaking Latino farm worker communities? No, it is no coincidence. In fact, there was a third landfill down in the Imperial Valley that recently closed, but was also in a Spanish-speaking, Latino Spanish-speaking farm worker community. Waste Management's Kettleman Hills facility, Clean Harbor's Buttonwillow hazardous waste landfill are both operating on expired permits. Both were approved years and years and years ago, usually using racially discriminatory permit processes, including police intimidation and English-only processes. And I would add that moments before this webinar began, I received an email from the State Department of Toxic Substances Control informing us that there was yet more violations at the Kettleman Hills facility. And yet this is business as usual. Operate on expired permits, receive toxic waste from all sorts of industry and government, and operate on expired permits. This is not okay. So we need to find alternatives and work together. And a number of years ago, the state of California developed a screening and mapping tool called CalEnviroScreen. And it looks at pollution and health and other socioeconomic indicators. And of course, it confirmed what the communities have said for decades, that these communities are some of the most vulnerable and most at risk to pollution. And so these are the incentives and one of the motivations for Green Action welcoming the invitation to participate in this project. So let's go to the next slide. This is a picture from, about probably 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, at a community protest where a busload of Kettleman City residents came up to the US EPA regional office in San Francisco for a protest about the toxic waste dump. And the pictures that some of these mothers are holding are pictures of their children who were born with birth defects. And Green Action and the community group, again, about 12, 13 years ago, documented and exposed the fact that there was a huge birth defect and infant mortality cluster in this tiny town. What caused it? We're not sure, but something we believe toxic in the environment did cause it. And again, this is further incentive for us to work with all of you and communities to address the problem at the source of it. Next slide, please. Now, toxic materials just don't end up in toxic waste landfills. Illegal dumping, as well as dumping in giant municipal solid waste landfills, is also a problem and also disproportionately impacts low-income, working class, and communities of color. We see illegal dumping being a huge problem in urban, rural, and also in many indigenous communities. And it's not just, we're not talking literally littering. We are talking where, and sometimes it's local businesses, sometimes it's outside companies who think they can just go into Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco or drive into Kettleman City and just dump stuff because they don't want to pay the cost of disposal or proper recycling. And it is also a fact that government regulation and enforcement is usually lax. This is a big problem that Green Action and our community partners, and I will add a number of government agencies, are working together to try to address, but it's a huge problem. Next slide, please. When groups talk about recycling, including among the broadly defined environmental groups, there's really a divergence of what is meant by recycling. Some groups think that incineration, including so-called waste-to-energy facilities, is somehow recycling. We don't think so. And neither does I'd say neither does the entire environmental justice movement. And I think we're making headways in educating other groups about this as well. The fact is that incineration, including so-called waste-to-energy incinerators, cannot completely destroy the hazardous waste. They emit harmful contaminants into the air, a wide range of hazardous pollutants, hazardous air pollutants, particulates. And one of the things that's clear is that incineration cannot destroy mercury in these lamps, and mercury ends up in the air and the ash. We also educated, in fact, PSI, that in California, for example, and we see the same pattern nationally, that the state's 2 municipal waste garbage incinerators are both located in and next to low-income working class communities of color. There's as some of you or all of you may know, there's a whole new generation of what we call, informally we refer to as incinerators in disguise. More technically speaking, they're 2-stage incinerators, but their proponents, including many in government, refer to them as, and they claim they're waste to energy, many of these, and they refer to them as gasification, plasma arc, and pyrolysis, and they claim they're non-incineration technologies. In fact, they're two-stage. They heat the materials and then they burn the gases. And what we've seen is many, not only don't they work very well, but many of the emissions are very similar to traditional incinerators. They are harmful and add to the problem and basically reduce the incentive to get rid of these toxic products in the first place. Next slide, please. So to promote safe recycling, and for all of you who are in government agencies and groups like PSI, and again, we really want to thank PSI for understanding the need for the public to be informed and engaged and involved. These are some of the points that we shared with PSI and want to share with all of you. Number one, community involvement is essential if we want to be successful, and also ethical. In many communities that are disproportionately impacted by illegal dumping, by garbage dumps, by toxic waste landfills, by incineration, by unsafe recycling facilities, often they are very diverse and people speak many languages. So the education and outreach needs to be done multilingually. And again, because there's large percentages of our communities where English is a second language, where many people don't even speak English. And that's fine, but they have a right to know what's going on and be involved. So we encouraged, and again, PSI recognized this, but we encourage all of you in government as well to establish partnerships with community and environmental justice organizations that are impacted by by illegal dumping and dangerous disposal. And very importantly, funding for projects promoting safe recycling need to be shared, not just should be, must be shared with community and environmental justice organizations that are community-based, that have community knowledge, that are on the ground, and we have invaluable expertise in helping to implement successful programs. And that's what we have been doing with PSI on this project. So next slide, please. So when PSI reached out, we really talked about, they introduced the project and their goals. We shared more about our organization, our work, the communities we work in, the networks we're part of. And together we collaborated on educating and engaging diverse stakeholders in really what I would refer to as ground zero frontline communities. We worked together to create multilingual fact sheets. So PSI, having a lot of expertise on this specific issue, did some first drafts, asked for feedback from Green Action and many of our community partners. So we kind of vetted it with a lot of key community partners to make sure that they were accessible and community friendly. And a better product came out of that. Although the initial drafts were good, it came out even better. We translated these into Spanish and also into Chinese to make them accessible to communities most impacted. And then we shared with PSI our recommendation for a key focus of our work with this project. And we let folks know about the IVAN network, identifying violations affecting neighborhoods. And IVAN is in California, and I'll tell you more about that. It started many years ago by one of our colleague organizations, Comité Cívico del Valle, based in the Imperial and Coachella Valley down in the most southern parts of California. And IVAN is very unique. They're multi-stakeholder. They bring together community and environmental justice organizations, local, regional, state, and federal government agencies, and some businesses. And its mission is to identify violations and work together to problem solve to protect health. So this was the perfect venue to really share this information about the LAMP recycling project and enlist support. So we arranged for Suna from PSI and my colleagues, Maricela Mata Zalatori, my coworker from Kettleman City, to make presentations to the Ivan monthly meetings. And these presentations were made in the people of color community of Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, home to the infamous and notorious Hunters Point Naval Shipyard Superfund site and countless other pollution sources. There were presentations to the Eastern Coachella Valley and Imperial Valley Ivan network meetings, and those are hosted by Comité Civico. Green Action actually hosts the Bayview Hunters Point Ivan. And there was a presentation made to the Kern County Ivan network, and the Coachella, Imperial, and Kern were done bilingually as well, and which again was really important. And we were so glad to hear the feedback from our community partners that they were, number one, really excited about including these in their agendas and meetings, and that the responses were really enthusiastic. So I think it really showed the effectiveness of this multi-stakeholder approach, the importance, both ethically and effectively, in involving communities. So we can wrap it up in a second. Yes, next slide. And that's the last slide. So how do you like that? And so there you go, and look forward to any questions folks might have.
Great, thank you very much, Bradley. It's an honor to be working with you and your coalition on this project. And I also want to recognize Suna Bayrakal's work on this and making the connection here. It's very important for our organization to be doing this work. So I'm going to invite now our speakers to turn on their video cameras and come off mute, all of you together. We do have a bunch of questions here. We have limited time, unfortunately, right here. So I'm going to ask if we can keep the questions, the answers to the questions more limited. We have 10 of them in right now. So let's give it a try. Victoria Davis asked, did you know, well, she didn't know that HID lights have mercury in them. And she says it seems like a confusing item for disposing and recycling in New Hampshire. Should they be collected along with fluorescent lamps? And should LEDs be collected as well due to lead and other substances? Who would like to take that one? Bruce, you want to take that one in?
Well, thank you. The answer is yes. HIDs contain pound per pound a lot more mercury than a fluorescent lamp, each one of them. So, and I am not familiar with New Hampshire hazardous waste and household hazardous waste regulations, so I can't answer, specifically to her area. But definitely they pose a danger. As far as LEDs, I must say that regulatorily the jury is not in yet. California programs all collect them and recycle them. I'm not sure how other states are managing LEDs. As some of the presentations point out, they do contain hazardous components, and in my opinion, should be properly recycled.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Quick rejoinder, or should we move on? Okay, next question then. Maria Bianchetti, how much mercury would be in a 8-foot T12 CFL? And if you can tell others what that is, so that they know. Manny, you want to take that one on?
Sure. So that's the million-dollar question. I think it's very hard to determine what's in. The technologies has changed, so the older lamps will have a lot more. As Bruce said, your HID actual has liquid mercury in there. There's an actual ampule in the HIDs, but for fluorescent tubes and CFL, typically industries talk about, in those ones, you would take your ballpoint pen and put a dot, and you'll see that's about the amount of mercury in it. But as the new technology come in place, less and less of the tubes have mercury in. Not all of them necessarily have it. Now new technology like LED. So it just depends on who the manufacturer is, how old the lamp is in terms of how much mercury is in there.
Okay, thank you. Here is a question for Bruce. In the region that you cover, what % of all spent mercury lamps get recycled?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. And I'm just not qualified to answer it. I don't know of any study in Alameda County that has addressed that question directly. So I'm sorry. I think it's a very and I think Manny pointed out how difficult that question is to answer. You know, when a lamp becomes spent, it's a hard question. You know, it's a hard thing to know, so it's even harder to figure out what percentage of the spent lamps are being captured by the different recycling and just different proper disposal methods, and then would be improperly disposed.
Yeah, scary for the communities also that are accepting these into the landfills and incinerators as well. Other question here is from Carla Streigel-Winner. She'd like to know about when she could expect mercury lamps to be tailing off. I think, Manny, you had a little chart on this. 2019, I think, was where you saw that bend. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely on the collection side, the bend is going down, but also on the sales side. The slide that I showed about how fast the LEDs are coming into place. LED technology is not only replacing the CFL and the incandescent, but it's also replacing the fluorescent tube. So industry is caught off guard on how fast LEDs have come into the market and taken hold. As any technology comes into place, as the cost comes down, as the quality goes up, you're going to see the uptake even more. So I think we're seeing the signs of the end of the mercury lamps, both for sales and for collection.
David Panofsky asks, where are the Alameda County lamps being sent for recycling?
Okay, great question. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly which state, which location our vendor is using. However, they're being recycled at EPA approved, lamp recycling facilities, using, following all of the regulatory requirements that the EPA would impose and being inspected in the process.
Are there audits, Bruce, for that, and
yes,
available to the public as well if they were interested?
Yeah, of course. If I'm sorry I can't answer the question as directly as I should, but
yeah,
it's public information. However, just be aware that if you're using a public program like a household hazardous waste program, there's no question that the material is going to end up at a EPA approved hazardous waste approved recycler. That's because all of our programs are very conscientious and also are protecting our liability and the public's liability in this.
Okay, Michael Bender has a question, and I just have to acknowledge Michael as the guy who founded the North America Hazardous Materials Management Association here, the group for toxic products in the United States many moons ago, and I was on the founding board working with Michael. So hi, Michael, nice to virtually read your question anyway. Does Alameda County collect LEDs, and if so, how many have you collected? That's probably another question, Bruce, a little maybe too much onto the data, but a good question nonetheless.
All right, again, good point. I mentioned that the quantity of lamps that our county collects year over year hasn't changed much in the last couple of years. And the fact is that we collect and commingle the LED lamps with the, so our numbers reflect that LED lamps and CFLs are counted together. That's just how we measure. So, have the amount of CFLs declined? Yes. Have perhaps the number of, the amount been masked by the fact that we're recycling a lot of LEDs now? Yes. We do see fewer CFLs in general because a lot of the hardware stores and other places do receive those back, whereas they do not generally accept straight lamps.
Okay, thank you. Paul Abernathy writes in here that data are scarce, but he estimates as much as 50% is being recycled there. And Paul is with the head of the Association of Lamp Recyclers. Thank you, Paul. Let me ask a question, Bradley, for you. This is from David Panofsky. Green Action may consider reviewing lamp recycling and processing facilities and worker protection from mercury vapor. Is Green Action aware of mercury vapor and lamp processing worker protection?
Good question, but we haven't. This is really the first time we specifically looked at the issue of lamps containing toxic materials specifically. So I think it would be an important thing for us to do. We have not yet done that.
Okay. All right. David also has a couple other questions here. So this one, Manny, is for you. Are the product care recycling standards for lamp recyclers available to U.S. state agencies or the public?
Yes, they are. They're actually posted on our website. So if you go to productcare.org and look up lights and look up the service provider resource area, you'll be able to find the standard in there.
Thank you. Peter Maxson asks, so is there general agreement that we shouldn't be using fluorescent lamps any longer? Should we get all those retrofits that were retrofitted just recently and just toss them out for LEDs, which are probably what's happening right now anyway? Yes, Michael Bender says, get rid of them, recycle them, or at least, so that's another question. Are they being recycled? Is this material, mercury, being recycled or retired? You don't want to be collecting that mercury, right, and putting it back into products again. Where is this all going? Eventually, where is that mercury going? Is it being disposed of, or is it being recycled?
So
Anyone know?
yes, yeah. So I don't know. Paul might weigh in from the Association of Lighting and Mercury Recyclers, but my understanding is that the majority of it is being stored, awaiting a long-term disposal solution in the United States. Some of it is being converted to a material that is non-reactive and being disposed in Canada, where there are regulations that allow that. And very little of it is being reintroduced in new products. That's my understanding.
Okay, thanks. And Michael Bender said environmentally sound disposal. So thanks for that. I'm going to, since I've gotten through all of the questions that we had in there, and we're out of time, unfortunately, I'm going to start the wrap up, if you will. But let me ask if if people have some questions still, send them to us. We'll send them out to the speakers and get some answers to you. So thank you. So with that, if you could turn to the next slide, I'm going to come into the thank you for all of our speakers here. I want to thank Suna, particularly for setting this up, Bruce, Manny, and Bradley for your participation today. It was great information, just a lot of stuff. And it is the tip of the iceberg here for these kind of products. It's not getting the attention that it should. And we really hopefully started something here. So all of our webinars and web conferences are recorded. So if you want to access them or missed anything and want to listen again, the recording of today's webinar and the slides will be posted within 24 hours on our website, and you'll receive a direct link to the webpage via email tomorrow. To access those recordings of other webinars that you might have missed, you can get onto our website, productstewardship.us, click on events, and then on-demand webinars. We have 2 more great events coming up. Please join us June 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for the spectrum of approaches to U.S. packaging EPR. That's tomorrow. We already have close to 500 people registered for that one. As you can tell, packaging is a big issue here in the United States now. After 15 years, the producers and waste management industry are finally starting to come to the table here and talk with us about EPR. So that will be that'll be tomorrow, and then we have another one Wednesday, June 23rd, 11 a.m. Eastern. That is a global webinar that we do with the Extended Producer Responsibility Association from Europe, EXPRA. That is on EPR, what's the role of waste management sector in EPR systems. So since they're engaging, we really want to delve into their role. As soon as the webinar ends, you'll see a webinar evaluation that will appear in your browser. And we really would appreciate it if you could fill that out, give us some advice, particularly for this webinar. What more would you like to see? What's the next step? How can we better engage and move forward on the issue that we started here with the areas that are very much hit by pollution, as Bradley was mentioned, and we really need to take these toxic products out of there and to see how we can dispose of them more appropriately right now. Once again, I want to thank all of our panelists, thank all of you in attendance for participating, and hope to see you in a future webinar. Take care, everyone. Hopefully we can see you in person real soon. Bye-bye.